All right, do your thing. All right, do your thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Welcome to Die Gaming with your host, Cory Feldman,
Oh, God.
and your host, Robin.
Yes.
And we're here to talk to you about fighting games. If you can't see that, it's Street Fighter Alpha 3. There, you can actually see it.
We're shooting the dark tonight because we're goth as hell.
That's why I'm wearing a black leather jacket and I
Yeah.
got my emo haircut.
This is the only thing I could wear. Anyways. Yeah, we're here to talk about fighting games, including the origins, what our thoughts are. Basically, jerk off to nostalgia. The world today, fighting games is all about tournaments, esports. These games are built for it. It's all about balance. It's still a giant moneymaker, and a lot of studios will kind of hoe out people in terms of the original launch with characters. I mean, before you know it, you're spending $200 to get a fighting game that should be $60 if not less. Anyways, we are doing kind of a show and tell today, going over our history and whatnot. Mainly Rob's big history with a lot of these older games.
Yeah, my big history with 90s fighting games, which I believe that when it comes to fighting games, that they were only ever really relevant in the 90s. And I mean, I know. Look, I'm biased when it comes to my opinion when it comes to fighting games, but let's just be honest here. Fighting games don't really they don't really begin with Street Fighter, because there's Street Fighter 2, and people
You say you're Bison?
when it comes down to fighting games as a relevant.
Do you see what we're working with?
Look, this is an unscripted.
Very poor. Well, not
Very.
completely poor.
This is
but,
unscripted. This
yeah.
is very poor. We're just here to do it. But I'll get back to what I was
I
saying.
love that poster, but it will not stay taped to that one.
Street Fighter 2, which is essentially the beginning of the fighting game era that was predominant throughout the early and mid 90s. And if you're old enough to have actually gone to arcades in the early 90s, you would know how big Street Fighter 2 was.
Oh, there's
And
also that one.
yeah, we have this back here. But after Street Fighter 2, there were fighting games left and right, just left and right, left and right, just everywhere. The most popular fighting game besides Street Fighter 2,
Oh, Jesus.
Mortal Kombat.
I see what you did with that now, because that was mine, and you wanted it.
Well, it was, but see, I have a Sega Genesis that I can actually play
Okay,
this
okay,
on. But the original
Thanks,
Mortal
Arcade
Kombat,
One Up, by the way, if you guys managed to watch this.
and I'm gonna be honest with you. I think the most popular arcade game of the '90s was actually Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 was probably the only game that I can remember going to an arcade and seeing people standing in line for.
I saw that
And-
with Street Fighter. I experienced that with Street Fighter, though.
Well, I mean, I didn't see it as much with Street Fighter 2, and I guess Mortal Kombat was, it came out in '92. Street Fighter 2 came out in 1991. Mortal Kombat 2 came out in 1993, and that was definitely the pinnacle of the of that era. Now, after 1993, you had games.
Well, let's hold up before we start getting to that, before we start moving on to that.
Oh,
We're
okay.
going Quick pace.
My bad. All right.
We need to get to the point where you had Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat dominating the arcades. People were in there. You stood in line, you're dumping out quarters. But then the consoles changed everything. Super Nintendo, Street Fighter 2. That game was $75, $80, if not $100, depending on where you went.
It wasn't. I can tell you it was an
But
$80 game.
I had quit going to the arcade to play Street Fighter 2 because Toys R Us and other places we had a Super Nintendo kiosk where you could just but basically you're going in, you could just sit around for like an hour and play Mortal Kombat without dumping quarters into something. Did they care back then? No. The kids today will never know about what Toys R Us really was or really what arcades were. I mean, you can go to an arcade bar now, they're great, still kind of the same thing, but it wasn't that. There was arcades back in the 80s and 90s were just, it was intense bits and intense hiding from arcade bar now, they're awesome, but it's just people like, oh, my dad played Pac-Man. Depending on where you go around the country, the greatest arcade, which is not an arcade bar, is Galloping Ghost outside of Chicago. That place is amazing. was texting him when I was there. He's like, "Hey, they got this rare game."
Oh,
I was like, "Yeah,
okay. Seriously, you sent me a pic. We were talking about fighting games.
yeah,
You sent me a picture of Bloodstorm,
yeah."
and that game is extremely rare. Like
That
it's
place is a
almost
museum.
impossible to find.
If you a lot of people will try and get arcades at home, and that whole multicade thing's not. That's not a thing. This is better and cheaper than owning a multicade. I don't want a whole bunch of ROMs and emulator. Just it's not the same thing. I want individual things. But my old roommate years ago, he went out and got somebody had a cabinet with WWF WrestleMania, and that's a whole other generation of fighting games that we probably won't get into because that's still kind of sports.
Kind of makes me
But
think of Saturday Night Slam Masters,
yeah, Slam
which is
Masters
also
and
technically a fighting
yeah,
game.
Slam Masters and WrestleMania and hell, Pit Fighter.
Actually,
Um,
yeah, that you could say that's the genesis of like Mortal Kombat, like the digitized graphics.
hmm And but he got WrestleMania, the arcade game, rebuilt it, and it was great. It was fun as hell. But after a month of that being plugged in, its power bill was $600. Those things aren't efficient, and you wonder why arcades started going downhill where they couldn't profit because the upkeep on arcade machines are ridiculous. And on top of that, you got a power bill to sustain. Like it's understandable over time why it didn't work out, but kind of gotten onto the arcades. But
No, that's okay, but I want to interrupt you real quick and talk about arcade. The thing about arcade machines is that they're only relevant for so long, and then they're just sitting there, and you're literally running this heavy machine that
that's
no
true.
one puts any quarters in. I mean, what somebody comes in like once a week and that's it. You got 50 cent, you got $1 in there.
I mean, my,
That's
my,
not
my
it doesn't
backup
pay for itself
my
anymore.
backup when Street Fighter was sold when I was a kid was Final Fight. Because nobody was ever on Final Fight. But I'm like, well, shit, it's Capcom. It feels like Street Fighter, but it's beat 'em up.
Hmm.
So we rolled that. All those games. That was what was great about the Super Nintendo. Is it brought those arcade fighting games and stuff like that home. Whereas the Genesis really couldn't replicate that well, but the Super Nintendo did enough to get that by. But we move on to the PlayStation One, and you get the height of two-dimensional fighting games that are basically arcade ports. Yeah, the ones that the Street Fighter Two and Super Nintendo Hyper Champion got by, and they were solid, but you didn't get that sound. We had CD quality audio.
Best soundtrack for any Mortal Kombat game is Mortal Kombat Trilogy for the PlayStation. That is it because it's a better version of the Mortal Kombat 3 soundtrack. It's like he said, the CD quality is perfect too.
That was the biggest thing that people don't realize, and that's the biggest thing people just don't realize when CD-based games
Yeah.
came out is you got audio, and even with that, with Eternal Champions on Sega CD, you did get full motion video, but when everything hit the PS1 and the Saturn, it really opened up, and the Saturn owned everybody on the two-dimensional sprites and graphics. They couldn't hang with the 3D. That's why Tekken never made it over there, even though they had Virtua Fighter. Speaking of Virtua Fighter, this game right here changed the scope of where fighting games would go in the late '90s and early 2000s. So much so, we had Virtua Fighter take over, and then Sony, obviously not owning the rights to that, went out to Namco and brought over Tekken.
I don't have a copy of Tekken, unfortunately.
I do, but it's on the computer. But Sega had also Soul Calibur. That was Namco, but that went towards the Dreamcast. It came over and dominated, and everybody wanted to be that. Even the launch game, Battle Arena Toshinden on PlayStation, was basically Soul Calibur before, but the fighting controls are awful. But you didn't care. You just spent $300, $400 on a PlayStation, and you had a 3D fighting game that was set in like an arena. A game is vastly underrated for when it came out. People kind of forget about it, but if you find it, go back and play it. They had supers and finishers, but they're ungodly to pull off, much like Eternal Champions.
Well, Eternal Champions, you had to hit the person the last hit to defeat them has to be like lined up with a certain landmark in order to get the finishers. The finishers in Eternal Champions are actually pretty easy to pull off. Now,
I never played
the
one of those
ultra,
games.
what you would call ultra desperation moves for like say Art of Fighting,
That's what I'm thinking.
the the first game to ever have the basically the in game finishers. I mean, they're not fatalities, but um, Art of Fighting was the very first game to ever have the. They were originally called Ultra Desperation moves. And Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and the only copy I have is a GBA copy that came out in 2001. Uh, I mean, it's props, but whatever. But Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo was the first one to ever have the super moves in a Street Fighter game, and I think they were perfected in Alpha, particularly Street Fighter Alpha 3. This bad boy.
Got all that glare.
Yeah, I know, man, but it is what it is.
So those were still rocking at that point, and things had kind of spread out by the time 1996 came around. The mainstream had gone 3D, but there was still a cult following. Plus, for the 2D fighters, and part of that's because Capcom struck a deal with Marvel to put out, you know, Marvel-based fighting games to take on Capcom characters.
Still think X-Men versus Street Fighter is the best one of that generation.
I love that arcade cabinet, but they were, sales were struggling, and they couldn't keep up with the 3D powerhouses. And proof of that would be games like Street Fighter X and Street Fighter X2. They tried to make Street Fighter a 3D fighting game, and it was I think there's one that came out on PS2 and Xbox as well that was a lot better than the originals. But they were playable. It was doable. But things have moved on to 3D, and a lot of 2D games such as Sonic and you can argue Mario. The transition just wasn't there for 3D, and things are struggling with camera angles. Castlevania is another one that just didn't survive. I mean, even arguably to this day, did not survive going to 3D.
No.
A lot of fighting games tried, and you look at Mortal Kombat going to polygons and eventually going to a 3D plane. The games were a lot different. But, in the late 90s, especially when Dreamcast came out, that was the ultimate fighting game system. I mean, seriously. Dreamcast had Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2,
Mm-hmm.
had X-Men vs. Street Fighter 2, it had Street Fighter 3, which I'm not a fan of Street Fighter 3. It's about the only one I don't
I mean,
like.
it's you might not like it, but I think, not being biased, I think it's a pretty good game. I don't particularly care for it. I only ever played it on an Anniversary Collection.
The artwork is definitely more anime inspired on Street Fighter 3 than it was in the past. But Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for Dreamcast was like the one to haul in forever. And then you had the Soul Calibur Dynasty start on Dreamcast, and it was, what was the first game? It wasn't Soul Calibur. It was Soul Edge.
Soul Edge, yeah.
Soul Edge, that was the first one.
Never played that
And
before.
it was just a more, finished product as compared to something like Battle Arena Toshinden was, because it kept everything in a ring. At that point, what Virtua Fighter was on Dreamcast, or was there one?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. I don't have the
I don't think
information.
it was Virtua Fighter.
I can't remember Virtual Fighter being on there.
I think it was Saturn, and that was it. And then they
Saturn-
started coming over to PS2.
Saturn have both Virtual Fighter and Virtual Fighter 2. You boo boo. You boo boo. You boo boo.
Yeah, we want to get to about 2000 where the Dreamcast was, but we've forgotten about some gems that are, well, we didn't forget, everybody just kind of forgot, but a lot of cool followers of fighting games. They're very playable and enjoyable fighting games exist with, let's start with this one, Turtles Tournament Fighters. Yeah, it was a Ninja Turtles fighting game that was, 2D fighting game on Super Nintendo. There was one on Nintendo. It was much
Forget
more
it.
awful.
That's just a NES collector's game.
That's
Nobody
all
cares.
that is. And
There's
what
one
are
for the Sega Genesis, and it's awful. It's
what are
not.
your thoughts on Tournament Fighters compared to the big boys?
I think Tournament Fighters was on par with Art of Fighting and Street Fighter 2 or Street Fighter 2 Turbo. It had the Ultra Desperation moves. Once you got the energy bar all the way up, you hit X and A, and you could do your super finisher. And Michelangelo probably had the best one because it was very much like Robert and Rio on Art of Fighting. His name's Rio. It's not Ryo. It's Rio, but whatever. They had the original Ultra Desperation moves on Art of Fighting, and then they incorporated Ultra Desperation moves into Tournament Fighters. I don't know what they called them in Tournament Fighters anymore. I can't remember off the top of my head. But Tournament Fighters for the Super Nintendo was that's definitely as good as any of the best fighting games for Super Nintendo. But the one for the Sega Genesis is awful. It's just a bad game. You can't pull the moves off. You can't pull off the finishers. You can, but it's a hit and miss. I mean, I like a game where if you do it correctly, you get it done each and every time. Whereas that has too many dead spots. It's awful. It's one of the worst mechanics for a fighting game I can remember on the Sega Genesis. I think Time Killers for the Sega Genesis is better than Turtles Tournament Fighters.
As for you bring up Art of Fighting.
Which Art of Fighting 2 is probably like my top 3 fighting games of all time are the original Mortal Kombat. I can't believe I have to do this, but
Should just put them all in front of us.
well, I mean, it's because I keep stacking them. But this is my second favorite fighting game of all time. If you can actually get through the glare, Eternal Champions Challenge from the Dark Side has the best '90s finishing moves. I mean, as far as like the
that's
bloody,
sporty.
as far as the yeah, puppy dog. But as far as the blood and guts, gory fighting games, Eternal Champions Challenge from the Dark Side is definitely my favorite of all time. Second favorite fighting game of all time for me, and my third favorite would be Art of Fighting 2. Art of Fighting 2 is one of the most difficult fighting games. If you can actually find a copy of see, I'm assuming that people actually just have consoles and they're not going to download emulators.
Well, no, why would you do that?
Because I particularly,
What is he doing?
he's hanging out. He wants to be in the video. He's your poo. Yeah. I was telling you about my top 3 Mortal Kombat, Eternal Champions Challenge from the Dark Side, and Art of Fighting 2. Those are my top 3 all-time favorite
What I
fighting
want
games.
to bring up is there's a forgotten console that was ridiculously expensive because it was all arcade ports of Japanese fighting games like Art of Fighting, and that was the Neo Geo.
God, man, you talk about an expensive system to begin with, and then the games themselves were, I mean, what, $200-$300 a piece because they were basically like these thick, like arcade.
Just plug and play type stuff, and the ridiculous cartridges that held a lot of information, and I think a lot of processing.
We haven't
It's
mentioned
basically a home arcade, and besides the army game where you went side, what was that?
that's Metal Slug.
Metal Slug. Besides that, it was all fighting games. You had Samurai Showdown, Art of Fighting, King of Fighters,
Fatal Fury.
all that, and that was definitely for a niche crowd.
Niche. It's
That was
okay.
definitely for a niche crowd to.
We'll get back to where we left off. You were talking about Soul Calibur, and that is entering the 3D era. And I don't have a copy of it, but the very first Mortal Kombat that was 3D was Deadly Alliance. Now, Deadly Alliance is a pretty decent game. It does feel a little unfinished. There's only one fatality per character, and the character selection it's not the best, but it's a pretty good game. It has pretty good. It has a good soundtrack.
You just skipped one. And it was unfortunately on Dreamcast since Mortal
I'm sorry.
Kombat 4.
I totally forgot about Mortal Kombat 4. I never actually owned that game, and I've probably only played it one time at the arcade, and that's one of those games I do want for my collection. But damn, I totally forgot about that one. That one came out in 1997.
Yeah, it was only on Dreamcast at home. Didn't make it any other platforms because it was supposed to be.
Well, they put it on. There is a PlayStation version.
There was?
It's rare, but there is a PlayStation version of that game.
That game was still side-scrolling, but it was polygons instead of what we got behind me, which is pictures of people, animation.
It's
stuff like that.
digitized graphics. That's what
And I do
it
want
was.
to bring that up because, in case we didn't tell you, you didn't watch the first show, and you're halfway through this going, what the fuck are these people talking about? We are ADHD as hell. This is unscripted.
Well, he
and we
is.
just motion capture fighting game that I have a special place for my heart. Street Fighter the movie, not the arcade version because that thing's unplayable. I bought 2 games at launch when the PlayStation originally came out. And that was NBA Jam Tournament Edition, which is arguably the best version of that game. And then also Street Fighter the movie, because we were just like, oh, it looks realistic in Street Fighter. It played well. It was a little bit stiff, but it don't get enough credit. The roster it's a little bit nerfed, but it had Akuma. Akuma wasn't in the arcade version.
As long as it
Akuma
has
was
Bison and Akuma.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the motion captures were just awful. But it was a solid playable fighting game, and I've played much worse. Pit Fighter, I still think, is probably about the worst thing to ever come out of a fighting game that I've played. There's plenty of awful, like, PC games and arcade games that nobody played that just controlled like absolute shit. You get into the 3DO and the CDI, and there's a lot of fighting games that were for that,
Ah, 3DO, Way of the Warrior.
and that's one of those.
Another one of the that's another one of those fighting games that has finishers, like where you actually kill your opponent.
But the first Street Fighter game with finishers was actually on 3DO too, and it's arguably the best console version of the older, pre 2000 Street Fighters was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Didn't see the light of day in anything else. I guess Capcom had inked an exclusive deal. It's probably one of the best games on that system. But you get the sunburst explosion when you pulled off a finisher, and that just kind of opened up things from there going forward. They didn't do fatalities; they went with finishers because they weren't trying to pull people's heads off and scare your parents. But that game also had Akuma as a hidden character, and it had CD quality. You go back and listen to the soundtrack; it's a lot different than even the arcades. Arcades couldn't capture CD quality sound in the 90s. Just they couldn't. They can now with the few that you see that come out. But that's one of the gems. If you could pick up a 3DO, is to find that game. And I don't even know if that was that even in arcades or was that specifically for
No,
3DO.
that was in arcades. I played
So,
it.
at that point, I moved on and just hadn't been really going to arcades at that point. I think at that point I was playing the Grid, which is the greatest arcade game of all time. Look it up.
I'm gonna interrupt you real quick. Do you remember the requirements to get Akuma as the last boss?
It's about ridiculous.
You had to get. You couldn't lose a round.
Mm-hmm.
On like all the way through, you had to win every round up to M. Bison. And when you got to M. Bison, he would come on the screen, do his what is it called, the Shogun Kusatsu is the official name of it in like your the Street Fighter Alpha 3 booklet, for instance. He comes in, he grabs him M. Bison, the screen goes white, and then M. Bison's on the ground, and then you're fighting Akuma. And I don't know if you could actually play as Akuma in the arcade version, but I know that you could play as Akuma through a like a sequence on the character select screen on the 3DO version, and you could also do that with the PlayStation version. I don't know if you remember the PlayStation version, but they had Street Fighter Collection and Street Fighter Collection 2. And if my memory serves me correctly, Street Fighter Collection was Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, whereas Collection 2 was the original Street Fighter 2 and I think Street Fighter 2 Turbo.
Also, I know those collections on PS2, they up the difficulty to make it nearly impossible.
Well, not PS2. I'm talking about PlayStation.
There was one on PlayStation?
Yeah, well, I'm not talking about Anniversary Collection. I'm talking about the Street Fighter collections for PlayStation. They're extremely rare. Those are like $60, $80 games on eBay, particularly like the.
Morning.
We were talking about Deadly Alliance, and I said that Deadly Alliance was the first 3D Mortal Kombat when I was totally wrong, and I'm glad that he caught that because we could have just left that in there. And people
wasn't like in a 3D round; it was just polygons and 3D backgrounds.
Okay.
And stuff like that.
All right, good. But with Deadly Alliance, that came out in 2002, and that's when Mortal Kombat actually started, doing the fully three-dimensional, and that's when they started doing Conquest. Conquest mode is like a story mode within Mortal Kombat. Now, the original Conquest mode in Deadly Alliance was just you basically are just going through a set of like 212 total stages, and it's just a linear path. Now, Conquest mode in the sequel, I'll pull this out so there's no glare. Now, the Conquest mode in the sequel is for Mortal Kombat Deception, which
cool.
Deception is my favorite 3D Mortal Kombat game. Now, I'm gonna kind of go back a little bit. We forgot to mention one fighting game, which is one of my all-time favorites. I would actually put that in my top 10. Is Primal Rage. Now, I don't have a copy of Primal Rage, but I do have Midway Arcade Treasures 2 that actually came out the same year as Mortal Kombat Deception back in 2004. Now, this was the first time that you could play on a console system the arcade versions of Mortal Kombat 2, Mortal Kombat 3, and Primal Rage. So I was incredibly excited to come across this.
I remember.
And at the same time, Mortal Kombat Deception Premium Pack
Hey.
came with uh, a Mortal Kombat 1, which came in this case.
Chantel.
And that's 2004. Mortal Kombat came out on consoles for the Sega Genesis, the Game Gear, the Game Boy, and
Mortal Kombat 2 on Game
the
Gear.
Super
By the way, if
Nintendo.
you're wondering, my dog is alive. He's just playing there.
But so I was obsessed with, because Mortal Kombat is my favorite fighting game, and probably back in the 90s it was my favorite game. Obviously, I've grown up and I've progressed onto real gaming like Legend of Zelda, Resident Evil, Silent Hill. Those are my three
Fighting games
favorites.
is still a real game.
I mean, it is, but I'm in the 90s. That's what I played. I played fighting games. But as I got older, I wanted to play more adult games. I wanted to play more involved games, but in 2004, they came out with the Mortal Kombat Deception. That came with the premium pack. Came with Mortal Kombat Arcade. It was the first time that you could play Mortal Kombat Arcade on a console, and I was very excited about that. And on top of that, you had the Midway Arcade Treasures too, with Mortal Kombat 2 and Primal Rage, which I also adore.
So you bring up Primal Rage, and it made me immediately think of another one I forgot. Killer Instinct.
Oh fuck, we're idiots, man.
Yeah, we are.
Killer Instinct is
So much stuff. Just a lot.
Killer Instinct is definitely one of the best ever fighting games. I think the first one is better than the second one. The second one came out as Killer Instinct Gold for the N64. And it's a good game, but Killer Instinct, the one that came out for the Super Nintendo, the original one, that is a great game. That probably has one of the best soundtracks, some of the best graphics, has a great character selection. It's very dark game.
Talking about a console that has very limited fighting games is the N64 because family friendly. But Trilogy did show up on the N64. You did have
I never actually played that one.
you did have Killer Instinct and maybe there was
You know what was on N64? Do you remember War Gods?
Yes. Yeah. Basically, anything that stuck out, you had Smash Brothers.
That doesn't count.
Doesn't really count.
I mean, there was no Street Fighters for the N64, was there?
Nope, not at all.
That's
Capcom
strange, isn't
didn't
it?
do jack squat besides Resident Evil 2, which is a surprisingly good port. It's more of a surprise of how well they did with that, especially with the sound. But yeah, Capcom didn't have too much to do with that console. But either way, fast forward, and Rob's talking about 2004. So around that time, fighting games just kind of died. You basically had Tekken, Virtua Fighter. You had all the 3D stuff. There's no two-dimensional plane fighting at that point. Tekken 5 might have been the peak. Tekken had a great run at the turn of the century. Tekken Tag Tournament, maybe the peak of God, was fantastic. There's really no tag system. It was a 3D game with a tag system. Yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 had a tag system back and forth, but this was Tekken with a slower paced tag system. Tekken 4 had a limited character selection, but was also like the first main entry on the PlayStation 2. Graphics were great at the time. Tekken 5 had too many people, and then that's basically when Tekken started dying. People were playing shooters. People were playing open world RPGs. Grand Theft Auto was at its peak. Nobody was really messing with fighting games. It wasn't until 2007 when we were reintroduced to Street Fighter. Street Fighter 4 is a magnificent fighting game and a great way to get the genre going again. Using the MT framework engine. Everything, it was still side scroll. It wasn't 3D, but everything was, a specific artwork. Everything was polygon. It was a unique art style that's still used to this day. But 4 really opened up things. You had Mortal Kombat tithering around with 3D. They went back to DC versus Mortal Kombat, which was awful. There's nothing to talk about. fatalities were blunted. It just, good idea on paper. They were trying to capitalize on Marvel and Capcom. And at that point, you had Street Fighter. And then they did their milking thing, which is one thing I did want to get into, is how Capcom since day one has milked their fighting games for different versions. You had 3 different versions of Street Fighter 4, Super and Ultra. Ultra never really got, but Super Street Fighter 4, the second edition of that, had everybody extra, but everybody was balanced. It had Vega. I don't think Vega was in the original. It was just 4 was just the epitome of it, and it's one of the reasons I wish my PS3 still worked, because I would play Super Street Fighter 4. But the fighting, everything kind of tethered around for a while. All of a sudden, we get to 2009, and here comes Capcom and Namco teaming up with the same game, but made by different developers. One saw the light of day, the other one didn't. And unfortunately, the one that didn't, that Namco was going to make, was the one that looked awesome.
You're obviously talking about Tekken versus Street Fighter.
Yes, but there was also Street Fighter versus Tekken by Capcom. That's the one that came out, ran on the framework, and it was I never really, it came out in the Vita, came out on PS3, came out on 360. It was solid, but it didn't really work. I could see the other one working, and they actually asked Namco within the past year about that game, and they just said they didn't get time to go around. They didn't have time to get around to do it, which is kind of stupid. But they're saying it's not necessarily out of the cards from happening. The greatest thing that really happened to Street Fighter 4 kind of got things rolling again. But when Mortal Kombat rebooted itself, there you go. Mortal Kombat 9, even after 10 and 11 coming out, I'm still under the impression that that's the greatest Mortal Kombat of all time. The roster's loaded, tons of fatalities, plays like the old style. People complain it's not balanced.
It has
enough.
a great story mode too.
But that game right there is what revolutionized story modes for fighting games. Like, they never really had story modes before. That had a great
Mortal Kombat Deception. Mortal Kombat Deception had the open world conquest mode that I was talking about with Deadly Alliance. Deadly Alliance, like I said, had 212 stages, and you're basically just going up a line. Now, with Conquest Mode and Mortal Kombat Deception, you had an open world that was that I think you had like 5 realms, and the realms, I'm not going to name them all, but it was like the Nether realm, the Earth realm, things like that. Now, you could say that was the beginning of what ultimately would become with the 2011 Mortal Kombat. But there was one Mortal Kombat we forgot to mention, the one that killed the series, Armageddon. I'm not
all lost in the PS2.
I'm not hating on Armageddon. I'm not hating on it, but it was just too much, and the fatalities were a creative fatality. You didn't have individual fatalities. You just had a fatality system that you just did fatalities on your own, and just got boring because you did the same thing over and over again. Now, after Armageddon, there was no Mortal Kombat for forever until
we had the DC universe of Mortal Kombat. Yeah, that doesn't really count.
I don't think anybody wants to count
that.
So
when 9 came out, it also went with they just went in a whole different direction. But going back to the story mode, as there were cutscenes. The biggest thing about the story mode is you were forced to play with, they tied in the roster so everybody would play as somebody for some point. You would discover people. That's the first time I really got hooked on Johnny Cage, and he's one of my go-tos now in any of the games. Johnny Cage is awesome. Never used to really do that back in the day on What's Behind Me. But no, Johnny Cage is a great character. And another one's Stryker. Stryker 9 was awesome.
He's a joke character,
he's
man.
Joke character, but he's still awesome. He is.
I'm not saying he's not awesome, but he was meant to be. He was meant to be like a little bit of a joke, kind of like Dan is on Street Fighter.
Yeah, and I actually made a comment the other day. They should. That's one thing now is video or fighting game bosses are absolute garbage, and that includes Mortal Kombat now. The one for 11, they're just throwaway characters like Marvel villains or Steppenwolf from Justice League. Nobody gives a shit. There's no Just no. Oh, well, Shio Khan was actually looking up this the whole time. Who gives a shit about Seth or Gale? Bison and Akuma should be the bosses. I mean, that's it. It's like, oh well, they've been nerfed basically to. I don't know. Just not the same. It's not the same
No,
thing.
Bison should always be the boss.
Yeah, not Seth. Going back to Mortal Kombat 9, it was the epitome of modernizing nostalgia at that time. And where 10 and 11 have excelled in visuals and fighting and have mainly been a component for competitive esports fighting. Street Fighter is still the face of that with 5, and it also was with 4. Um, They've kind of gotten a bit out of hand. Mortal Kombat 10 brought in a whole bunch of extra new characters because they want to try out different stuff, and it didn't mesh. 11 is excellent. I think it's the fighting game of the year. It's amazing, but they bring in the RPG elements they had in Injustice, which is the basically DC fighting game that is done by the people of Mortal Kombat, and that's 11. And it's such a great cover. Um, the games are absolutely beautiful, but I'm not a big fan of being able to customize move sets and then wanting to pull off something I know I can pull off and not have it because I customized it for something else. I just want access to all of them. You can just give us different costumes, but um, still the other thing is that is 9, 10, and 11. The story modes have just gotten so much better. Whereas Street Fighter launched in 2016 with like 10 characters as a beta, charging us $60. I bought it at launch. I didn't keep it that long after. Fighting mechanics are fine, but they wanted to throw something out there just to do tournament stuff. And here we are 4 years later with the Champion Edition coming out. That's full price. If you went through and bought them all with all the characters, all the DLC, it's like $200. Capcom just milks that stuff. Whereas Mortal Kombat just kind of recently got a little bit more annoying about it with all the special characters in 11. But they also kind of hoed out when they brought Joker over. I'm like, Joker's available in Injustice. Like, why? You could have had Ash from Evil Dead. Like, it's in the programming. What happened? Why didn't it happen? So, I think the modern day fighting games, the modern era, it's definitely recovered from the fallout that it had, 10, 15 years ago. Tekken, it took a while. Tekken 6 was awful. I think Tekken Tag Tournament 2 just at that point everything that swung back to 2D fighting, on a two-dimensional plane. I don't really cared about 3D, but I tell you what, Tekken 7 got it right. Tekken 7 is one of the best fighting games, if not the best fighting game I've ever played. It just feels like you put in the work. The hits are there. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's balanced. There's a lot of characters. It can get kind of overwhelming, but not really because there's a lot to learn. And as great as Street Fighter is for the competitive world, I think Tekken's better. You watch esports matches of Tekken 7, people fighting. You don't have to worry about fireballs. That's one thing I wanted to bring up from ages ago. I still remember the first time I was able to pull off a fireball from Ryu. I was at home on the Super Nintendo. That's something I never understood that stuff initially. And my dad and my uncle, when they'd play, nobody was doing the special moves. They were just like medium punches, light punches, whatever. Everybody was guile, and it's like, oh, I can do Sonic Boom. That's cool. Just couldn't figure out how to do the damn fireball. And one day I pulled it off. I was like, holy shit! And it changed my life forever. I became a man that day.
Yeah, I can actually remember the first time I pulled off the Dragon Punch, and it took a minute because the motion is like down. It's down forward and then like in between. And when I was younger, I was, oh, well, what does that mean? Like I didn't quite get it. But once I pulled it off, I eventually got to where I could pull it off every single time. And that's one of the reasons I'm pretty damn good at Street Fighters because it's easy once you figured it out. Like Akuma's finisher, the one I mentioned earlier, the Shogun Kusatsu or the Raging Demon. You press low punch twice, and then you press forward, low kick, and high punch at the same time. Now on paper, you look at that, and you're like, how the fuck do I do that? And once you pulled it off and you get used to it, it's you know if you play a fighting game and you can't pull off the move each and every time. That's usually a problem with the controls. And I've never had a Street Fighter since Street Fighter 2. I've never had a problem with a Street Fighter game where I couldn't pull off the Dragon Punch or I couldn't pull off the Fireball. I think maybe Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for the PlayStation 2, that one in particular, I might have had a little trouble um, with the moves because I think it's just a little off.
So back to the fallout of the fighting genre. There are two series that we left out. Well, technically one we didn't, but the peak of it, Soul Calibur. That was behind Tekken, but it was both Namco. It was both Namco. It was one with weapons and one that wasn't, and one was on a 3D arena type thing. But another one that might be one of the currently still, and it gets new releases, one of the biggest cold fighting games there are is Dead or Alive. And a lot of people remember Dead or Alive just for seeing the volleyball games and just seeing the tits and shit. But Dead or Alive is a actual legitimate, very technical and like deep fighting game. It's almost too much for a lot of casual fighters. People really can't hang with that. Uh, I think that was actually the first fighting game on the 360. The guy had rented that early on, just because it looked great at the time, and there were no other fighting games. Street Fighter was basically on a hiatus. Uh, Capcom just wasn't doing anything with fighting games for about 10 years. But the one that did sneak in there, and it really wasn't even them, and there were actually two. Capcom versus SNK for PS2 and Xbox was an excellent game that was not developed by Capcom. And
I had it for the GameCube. I had Capcom vs. SNK 2 for the GameCube.
that was a great series because it wasn't Capcom, it was SNK. So it was the guys that did Art of Fighting and Fatal Fury. All the guys did the Neo Geo games.
Basically, King of Fighters.
Yeah.
It has that vibe about it. Capcom vs. SNK 2 has that vibe.
And I mean, don't quote me on exactly what developer it was, but it was SNK, and they were involved with King of Fighters and the Neo Geo games. Another one that might be maybe the most underrated Nintendo Wii game ever is Tatsunoko versus Capcom.
Yeah, I know about that one.
I've only played that a handful of times, but using the Wiimote, surprisingly, it was a great, and visually it was a great game, but it only released on that system. There's nothing else that came out on. But that was another one where it wasn't done by Capcom. Like they were just kind of lit at that point and just kind of doing nothing. So I guess if your list, what is your podium of fighting games, the fighting series?
Oh, fighting series. I mean, uh, obviously Mortal Kombat is number one. That's never going to change. I because I love Eternal Champions, Challenge from the Dark Side so much, and I actually like Eternal Champions for the Sega Genesis as well. I don't. I wouldn't put that like number two as far as like series. I hate to be, you know, cliche and say it, but yeah, it's got to be Street Fighter. It's got to be Mortal Kombat. It's got to be Street Fighter. And then in third, I would put Eternal Champions. It's only two games, but I like it. But I would have to put Street Fighter ahead of Eternal Champions simply because Street Fighter has so many more games. You know.
When you're our age, and it was 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we're not that old.
And we
But
definitely don't
you
look
were
at it.
either a Mortal Kombat or a Street Fighter guy. I was a Street Fighter guy. It took me a while to come around to Mortal Kombat, but now you look at it, you're kind of down for whatever. I think people just like fighting games in general now. But my podium of fighting games, I'm actually gonna laugh at this. Maybe it's because of my past, but Street Fighter still goes one for me. My number two is Tekken, and then my number three is Mortal Kombat.
There's nothing wrong with Tekken, man. I I played two, I've played three, and I play a little four and five.
Two is my favorite in the series. I love the soundtrack and the feeling of the game. One, I couldn't stand Tekken One. I couldn't. But my family played the hell out of it, and that's all they played. And that's why I hated it. They're hogging the PlayStation. I'm like, it's fucking Wednesday night. Why you just keep playing Tekken and doing nothing? When the Tekken 2 came out, it just had such a better feel, and just felt more polished and more better produced. The music, though, music in 2 was great. 3 was a bit much. I had 3, I liked it at the time, but it doesn't hold up for me. 4 was a flash in the pan. 5 was great. 6 is my least favorite, and 7 is
What about tag?
I didn't play Tag 2. Tag 1 was great in arcades. That's what made that so great, is because that launched in arcades. But it was also an early PS2 release. It was basically not quite 4. I think it had better fighting. As for Street Fighter, I think the greatest is probably Super Turbo, and then Super, and then possibly the original. I didn't like Hyper Fighting because everybody just played the hell out of it. It was just different colors. 3 I didn't like, and then all the versions of 4. 4 was great when it first came out. Super was better. Ultra I didn't like, and then 5 is. I'm gonna find out here with Champion Edition here shortly, and it just looks like there's a ton of nostalgia in that game because they finally added everybody's actual stages. Whereas when it launched, it's like, here's 4 fucking stages, and that was it, In terms of Mortal Kombat, 9 is everything that's a go-to, and then I would say 2, and then 1, and then 11, and everything else just kind of throw. I did not like 3. Ultimate 3, wasn't for the combos, didn't like that stuff. Just never got into it.
Well, the game, the Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, Mortal Kombat 3, the mechanics are different from the first two because, like, Mortal Kombat 1 and Mortal Kombat 2 are essentially like the same engine.
Yeah.
The same feel and everything, and
that when I had Mortal Kombat 3 on PlayStation, when I rented it, it loaded when you took on Shane Tsung. That was very annoying. That's why they released Ultimate. It was terrible.
there's no way that Mortal Kombat will never not be my favorite fighting game, and Mortal Kombat 2, that would be my second favorite Mortal Kombat, and then I would have to go with
That's the one.
Mortal Kombat trilogy, particularly for the PlayStation.
I don't think that's just. To me,
That'd be my top 3 Mortal Kombat games.
That's almost like a collector's type thing for me because it's got everything in it. It's got every body, but it's not like I'm not going to consider that like a version in the line of the series of progression. It's just everything in one.
Well, that's fine.
But yeah, this show's a little bit of a mess, but when you have a lot on your mind and you got a lot going on and you're passionate about everything that you've played in the past and you jerk off nostalgia, it's just ridiculous. But the fighting genre, it's good to see that it's back where it needs to be. Not necessarily where it should be. It's all about esports. But
yeah, companies need to release an entire game. No DLC, release the game. And if
the ultimate pit of that was Ultimate Mortal Kombat, or Mortal Kombat. God damn it. On that was Marvel vs. Capcom 3. When everybody thought there was going to be this huge roster and they had 2 DLC, it was unbalanced, and they still charged out the ass for it. And then there's Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which was just a complete shit show from head to toe. Capcom at that point, that was for them, and at least now they're kind of back where they should be. They've had some good releases, but yeah. Anyways, yeah, the whole DLC thing, and on top of that, the collector's edition stuff, $400 for a Scorpion mask. Come on, man.
God, that's ridiculous, man.
And then people just hoard it up just to resell it later. Like it doesn't. But then at the same time, you get the Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite thing, which the stones are fucking Easter eggs. I mean, I gave mine away to somebody for Reddit Secret Santa because it was just taking up space. It was unopened. I got it on sale. I'm sure the figures were nice, but the game was shit. The demo was shit. So, hopefully we'll get a proper Marvel vs. Capcom 4 in the next generation. We will see. Anyways, do your thing.
This is Welcome to Die Gaming. Or, as you want me to say it, this is Welcome to Die Gaming. We are Feldman and Robin, or Cory and Robin, and we will be back next time. We'll get better at this, by the way.